Good morning. Hearing will come to order. Welcome to this morning's hearing to review the respective fiscal year 2020 budget requests for the United States Coast Guard, the Maritime Administration, and the Federal Maritime Commission. At any given moment, more than 20 million shipping containers full of raw materials and finished products are transecting the ocean neatly stacked on ships. They might cross the Atlantic, enter the bustling port of New York, New Jersey, and make their way up the Hudson River past Manhattan to my district. The Hudson River, the 315-mile conduit of commerce that lies at the heart of my community, moves over 17 million tons of cargo, worth over $32 billion in state commerce annually. For hundreds of years, this river facilitated trade and transit by sloop, steamboat, and barge. In fact, from my backyard, you can see the spot where Henry Hudson camped on September 14th, 1609. Looks much the same way today as it did then. For hundreds of years, it has been that way, and today the Marine Transportation System, or MTS, is an almost invisible network that facilitates roughly $45.4 trillion in U.S. commerce across oceans and thousands of miles of inland waterways. Yet the MTS and the regulatory agencies that oversee its function are perpetually under-resourced. This is surprising, considering the importance of the MTS to the U.S. supply chain, and moreover, it's fundamentally disappointing. This budget again underscores how little this administration understands or appreciates the importance of the U.S. shipbuilding and maritime industries and the agencies that regulate and facilitate commerce. Our Coast Guard stretches itself daily to execute its 11 statutory missions, from vessel safety inspections to search and rescue. Despite proposed budget cuts like this, it does so through its exemplary leadership. I'm pleased to welcome Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Carl Schultz to his first budget hearing before this subcommittee. Unfortunately, in my view, the FY 2020 Coast Guard budget goes so far as to walk back and significantly reduce the funding appropriated by Congress for the Coast Guard just last year, and that simply makes no sense. I'll have more to say on this during the hearing, but the fact that the administration would send up a budget like that, I think, is disrespectful to the organizations that do this critical work, because in reality, everybody knows it makes no sense. Coordinating and monitoring our maritime industries is the Maritime Administration, or MARAD, the agency whose programs and authorities foster and promote the American maritime industry to meet the economic and national security needs of our nation. In another unfortunate stroke, MARAD's budget is also shortchanged. Surprisingly, the administration makes no request for funding to carry forward progress made earlier this year, when Congress appropriated almost $300 million to initiate a new port infrastructure development grant program. The American Association of Port Authorities estimates that there is a $32 billion need to improve intermodal landside connections, hinterland connectivity, and facility infrastructure. Yet the administration has turned its back on supporting these investments to improve the efficiency and global competitiveness of U.S. ports and marine terminals. We need to recognize the importance of the MTS to the national economy and be proactive in our federal investments. The Federal Maritime Commission, or FMC, protects shippers and carriers from restrictive or unfair shipping practices of foreign flag carrier alliances operating in the U.S. foreign trade. And now with foreign carriers moving more than 95% of U.S. trade, the FMC's job has never been more important. That's why we need to make sure the FMC has more than sufficient resources to implement changes made in last year's Coast Guard Act to the Shipping Act, and make sure that U.S. port service providers and the Port of New York, New Jersey downriver from my district are able to compete and sustain good-paying jobs for U.S. workers. Our coasts are busier than ever. New uses emerge every day. It is the responsibility of these agencies testifying today to ensure that our marine transportation system remains reliable, sustainable, efficient, and safe. Look forward to engaging our witnesses this morning to learn if the administration's budget request comes close to meeting that challenge. And that doesn't mean we can't have disagreements about the right level of funding, but I think what is clear is that the administration's budget request fails in significant respects, and I'd be very curious to hear our witnesses' understanding of that issue. I now call on the ranking member, Mr. Gibbs, for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today and in your service to our great country. Thank you. The United States Coast Guard carries out a broad array of law enforcement, safety, national security, environmental protection, and response missions on water under the control of the United States. Unfortunately, both Congress and multiple administrations dating back to the 1990s have failed to make investments in the Coast Guard infrastructure to allow it to maintain, much less improve its capabilities to carry out its mission. By 2000, the Coast Guard offshore fleet was antiquated. It has made great strides since then in replacing high-endurance cutters and island-class patrol boats with the vastly more capable national security cutters and fast response cutters. Those successes came at the expense of adequate shoreside infrastructure investment and a lack of investment in modernizing the databases in which the service relies for smooth operations. The service faces another 15 years of major investments to complete its fleet recapitalization. It must still build 25 new offshore patrol cutters to replace the medium endurance cutters. It must also purchase multiple polar security cutters. If we expect the Coast Guard to effectively carry out any of its many missions, we cannot continue to defer shoreside and IT investments. Yet the administration again seeks $1 billion less than in fiscal year 2020 for acquisition and construction that was appropriated in fiscal year 2019. I am glad to say the bipartisan leadership of this committee and subcommittee has requested $2.8 billion in acquisition and construction funds for FY 2020. I look forward to the Commandant's views on how he plans to complete the necessary upgrades and replacements and maintenance of assets. Additionally, I am pleased to see the Maritime Administration has requested full funding for the Maritime Security Program. However, I am interested in how we can close the projected shortfall of merchant mariners needed to assure out national defense sea lift capability. I look forward to discussing that with the Maritime Administrator. Finally, Congress made changes to ocean shipping laws last year. I am interested to learn if these changes provided the Commission with the authority to assure that the U.S. service providers are treated fairly when negotiating with large international shipping alliances. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to holding this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I'd like to now recognize the chair of the committee, Mr. DeFazio, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. Tomorrow is National Maritime Day, a day to celebrate, us, the United States of America, as a great maritime nation. However, that news hasn't penetrated, apparently, to this administration or the White House. As I look at the collective budget requests for the three federal agencies responsible for oversight, regulation, and promotion of U.S. maritime, Coast Guard, Maritime Administration, FMC, there's not much to celebrate there. The administration has talked a lot about our competitiveness and trade and those things, but undermining these institutions. Have also talked a lot about drugs and drug smuggling, national security, and undermining the Coast Guard is not going to deliver on those goals. The Coast Guard went through a series of cuts because of the Budget Control Act, and finally Congress has begun to make up with some of that deficit. But the submission by the the Trump budget submitted to Congress would lower Coast Guard 10% below 19. And that's after the Coast Guard didn't get paid during the stupid shutdown, the only military service not to get paid. So I'd say these additional proposed cuts are disrespectful at best. As I mentioned before, there's been a lot of concern about drug smuggling. We had intel from the retired commandant last year or the year before last in Senate testimony that we can ID 80% of the actionable, with intelligence, actionable drug shipments, but we can only intercept 20 because the Coast Guard doesn't have the resources. So the Trump administration is going to take care of that problem. They're going to send coasties to the desert border. What a great idea. So I will have some questions about that. I'm also disappointed in the cuts for MARAD, 39%, zero out port infrastructure development grants, small shipyard grants, which help keep us competitive, a vital component of keeping a domestic U.S. shipbuilding interest industry, particularly in light of the communist Chinese government shipbuilding interests, which are trying to compete. There's, a little bit of good news, a small increase for the Federal Maritime Commission. Last year, we refocused them on these carrier alliance agreements, and there's a lot of work to be done there, so they will need that money and perhaps more. So this budget is a disappointment, but let's use this hearing to constructively critique and encourage our colleagues to allocate more adequate resources to each of these agencies in the coming budget year. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like now to welcome our witnesses. Admiral Carl P. Schultz, Commandant for the United States Coast Guard. We're delighted to have you here, sir. We're also joined by Master Chief Jason M. Vanderheyden, Master Chief Petty Officer for the United States Coast Guard. Rear Admiral Mark H. Busby, Administrator for the Maritime Administration. The Honorable Michael A. Khoury, Chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission. Gentlemen, we have received your testimonies without objection. That full statement will be included in the record, and since it has, we encourage you to limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes to give adequate time for the members' questions, but we appreciate your service and all you do for our country. Admiral Schultz.
Well, full committee Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify today. And as you mentioned, my written testimony, I appreciate that being entered to the record. On behalf of the men and women of the United States Coast Guard, Chairman, please accept my profound thanks for your unwavering support, including the fiscal year 2019 appropriation and the 2018 Frank Lobiondo Coast Guard Authorization Act. These were meaningful steps towards delivering the ready, relevant, responsive Coast Guard the American public expects and deserves. Yet our work is not done. If you take away just one thing from my testimony today, please remember this: readiness. Ready to push our maritime border 1,500 miles from our shore. Ready to preserve the $5.4 trillion in economic activity that flows through our marine transportation system on an annual basis. Ready to support combatant commander needs across the globe. Ready for the next hurricane season, which is just around the corner. And ready to put our cyber authorities to use as we adapt to 21st century threats. Without question, building and sustaining readiness is my top priority as Commandant, and we're at a critical juncture, or what I call a tipping point. Almost after a decade of near flatline operations and support funding, Coast Guard readiness is in fact eroding, just like the other armed services have experienced in recent years. Yet unlike the Department of Defense, Coast Guard funding is categorized as non-defense discretionary, which means we're excluded from the focused effort to rebuild our nation's military readiness, and hence we continue to find ourselves on the outside looking in when it comes to operationing and support plus-up funds. In 2017, the Department of Defense received a 12% boost in operations and maintenance funding, while the Coast Guard received just a 4% increase. Yet the Coast Guard's military contributions are immutable. Every year, we proudly expend over $1 billion in direct support to combatant commanders, but the $340 million of defense readiness dollars that we receive towards these ends has not increased in over 18 years. As an example of our growing defense portfolio, the National Security Cutter Berthoff is supporting the Indo-Pacific Commander in the South China Sea, enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea and protecting advancing interests throughout the Western Pacific. Though we strive for relentless resilience to execute Homeland Security and defense operations, if we continue to neglect our growing backlog of deferred repairs or on our capital assets, we'll lose ground in the fight to defend our homeland from evolving threats and challenges to the nation. Despite these challenges, I am extremely proud of the Coast Guard's contributions. In 2018, as part of the Department of Homeland Security's layered security strategy, our surface and aviation assets interdicted 460,000 pounds of uncut cocaine, more than all other federal agencies combined, and apprehended more than 600 drug smugglers. Disrupting transnational criminal organizations at sea, where they are most vulnerable, helps reduce the push factors responsible for driving migration to our southwest land border. Our national security cutters, what we call NSCs, have exceeded performance expectations by every metric, and now we must focus on transitioning from our outdated and costly medium-endurance cutters to our planned fleet of 25 highly capable offshore patrol cutters, which will be the backbone of the Coast Guard's offshore presence in the decades to come. In the polar regions, presence equals influence, and your Coast Guard's the sole surface presence protecting our rights and our projecting sovereignty. As access to the region expands and interest from China and Russia grows, it's in our national interest to enhance maritime domain awareness and build governance in this economically and geostrategically competitive area. To this end, the Coast Guard released the Arctic Strategic Outlook last month, a refresh of our 2013 Arctic strategy. In March, our sole operational heavy icebreaker, the 43-year-old Polar Star, returned from a 105-day patrol to Antarctica. The crew worked miracles to keep that cutter mission viable, battling a shipboard fire, engine room flooding, and numerous electrical outages. I'm proud of their efforts, but I remain concerned we are only one major casualty away from being a nation without any heavy icebreaking capability. New icebreakers cannot come fast enough. And I thank you, the Congress, for the $675 million provided in last year's 2019 appropriation. Coupled with the $300 million in prior year's appropriations, I'm thrilled to report we awarded a detailed design and construction contract for the first polar security cutter earlier this month, or last month in April. Stable and predictable funding is key to keeping this vital program on schedule. Finally, I appreciate the administration's support for initiatives that invest in our greatest strength, our Coast Guard men and women, our people. They represent tangible steps towards a mission-ready total workforce. A dollar invested in the Coast Guard is a dollar well invested and well spent. And with your continued support, the Coast Guard will live up to our motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, for this opportunity to testify. I welcome your questions.
Impressive example, Admiral Schultz. You brought that in with 5 seconds to spare. Master Chief, no pressure. Thank you so much. You may proceed.
Full Committee Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the honor of appearing before you to represent the terrific members of your United States Coast Guard. First and foremost, I want to say thank you for your support for the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act. With each unit I visit, I hear firsthand our members' concerns about another shutdown, and I hope I can count on your continued support to drive this legislation through to enactment. As I travel the country speaking with the men and women of our mission-ready total workforce, I can see the pride they take in serving their country. They are standing the watch, carrying out global operations, protecting our homeland and the maritime domain. But in order to continue to be successful, they need more resources. Last year's massive hurricanes in the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, as well as Typhoon Mangkhut in the Pacific, devastated communities around the United States and its territories. The men and women of your Coast Guard responded heroically, saving nearly 1,000 lives and millions of dollars in property. Each day we patrol the maritime domain domestically and globally, performing the multitude of missions entrusted by our government and the American public. This others before self attitude is consistent throughout our service and speaks to our core value of devotion to duty. The American people place their trust in and count on the men and women of our service, and we will not fail them. The size of the Coast Guard and the scope of our duties requires delegation of responsibilities far down the chain of command. We empower our junior officers and enlisted members far beyond our sister services, and they always make me proud. We maximize the talents of our people and utilize every resource to accomplish the mission. Your return on investment for every dollar spent on a coastie is immeasurable. With your continued support in recapitalizing our fleet, we will enable our dedicated professionals to excel in our missions. Building upon the success of the National Security Cutter and the Fast Response Cutter, the new Offshore Patrol Cutter will provide Coast Guard tools needed to efficiently and effectively meet our missions. Furthermore, we are thankful for the fiscal year 2019 appropriation, which provided funding for the first Polar Security Cutter. The Coast Guard currently operates America's only heavy and medium icebreakers and employs a small, specialized community of polar sailors. The unique skills necessary to operate these ships in the high latitudes of the Arctic and the Antarctic require specialized training and experience, and with your support, we will be able to retain and actually grow this important workforce. We are the world's finest Coast Guard, and the demand for our service has never been greater. However, I'm concerned about the erosion of our readiness that has negatively affected the quality of life for our service members. Our people, your Coast Guard, deserve adequate housing, appropriate medical services, and access to affordable child care. This country still honors the right to employ an all-volunteer military, and we hope to make the Coast Guard an employer of choice by providing benefits that offset the sacrifices that our families endure. Despite these challenges, I'm exceptionally proud to serve in the world's best Coast Guard alongside my shipmates, including both my son and my daughter, who recently re-enlisted for the second time. Our people feel valued and they serve their country with pride. They enjoy coming to work, they enjoy the missions we do, and they serve their country with pride. They enjoy, as their representative before you today, it is my job to raise your awareness of the challenges they face, which have been caused by erosion of readiness. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on behalf of the service members of your United States Coast Guard, I thank you for your continued support and for the opportunity to highlight some of the successes and challenges, and I look forward to your questions. Semper Paratus.
Thank you, Master Chief. We're also joined by Rear Admiral Mark H. Busby, the Administrator for the Maritime Administration. Admiral Busby, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning on the President's fiscal year 2020 budget priorities for the Maritime Administration. Congress recognized long ago that a robust U.S. merchant marine is critical for defending our nation and growing our economy. It provides the essential sea lift capacity our nation needs to respond to domestic and international crisis. It supports hundreds of thousands of jobs at sea and ashore. If properly valued and supported, it offers our nation the opportunity to control its domestic and international commerce. Regrettably, over the past several decades, we have allowed this indispensable national asset to erode. Today, of approximately 50,000 large ocean-going commercial vessels operating around the world, only 181 of them fly the U.S. flag. Of those, only 81 operate exclusively in international trade. The remaining 100 operate almost exclusively in domestic Jones Act trade. This decline in ships has contributed to a drop in the number of qualified U.S. mariners that a long-term national emergency would require. While commercial vessels provide sustained sea lift, our nation relies on the 46 government vessels of the Ready Reserve Force for initial emergency sea lift response to domestic crisis and military deployments. However, these vessels now average 44 years of age. We struggle to maintain their readiness. While funded by the Defense Department, the Maritime Administration supports the Navy's Surge Sea Lift Recapitalization Strategy, which includes a combination of targeted service life extensions, acquiring and converting used vessels, and building new vessels in U.S. shipyards. I would add that a central challenge is the fact that our maritime industry is not competing on a level playing field. We are matched against lower-priced foreign competitors who benefit from state subsidies, lax regulatory requirements, and favorable tax policies. This is all part of their attempt to achieve a strategic advantage against the United States. To help ensure a strong domestic maritime industry and the U.S. Merchant Marine, by supporting the competitiveness of the U.S. flag fleet and the education and training of the next generation of merchant mariners, the President's FY 2020 budget requests $682.5 million for the Maritime Administration. The budget request supports the Maritime Security Program, which provides a $5 million stipend per U.S. flag ship, enrolled in return for assured access to the 60 enrolled ships for military sea lift, and to a multi-million-dollar global intermodal network. The stipend also supports the employment of the qualified mariners necessary to crew the Ready Reserve Force. President budget also invests in the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, which trains and educates leaders obligated to serve as shipboard officers at sea and commissioned officers in our active and reserve armed forces. It also provides funding assistance to our 6 state maritime academies, which graduate approximately 3/4 of our entry-level merchant marine officers, and critically, includes funding for a 3rd new training ship. We greatly appreciate the work of those on this committee and across the Congress who support this critical investment in our merchant marine training infrastructure. Finally, the request provides funding for the ship disposal program, including support to maintain the nuclear ship Savannah while decommissioning its defueled reactor. In brief, as a nation, we must once again prioritize maritime issues if we're to adequately defend our nation and grow our economy. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the subcommittee's continued support of these priorities and look forward to your questions, sir.
Thank you, Admiral. We're also joined by the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, Mr. Curry. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Federal Maritime Commission's fiscal year 2020 funding request. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Commissioners Louis Sola and Daniel Maffei. Last year, this committee was instrumental in passing the Frank Lobiondo Coast Guard Act of 2018. The act broadened the Commission's authority to carry out its mission to protect the shipping public, and we are working diligently to implement the various parts of that legislation. The American economy relies on a competitive and efficient ocean transportation system. To meet that requirement, the Commission administers a focused antitrust regime tailored to the ocean liner industry. We continuously monitor cooperative operational agreements filed at the Commission by ocean carriers and by marine terminal operators. These collaborative business arrangements allow the ocean carriers or the marine terminals to achieve operating efficiencies and cost savings. We closely monitor the agreement parties' business activities together with the broader international ocean shipping marketplace for signs of improper collusive or anti-competitive behavior. We have a comprehensive and ongoing monitoring and compliance system that is constantly evolving to respond to changes in agreements, the industry, and the marketplace. Compared to the last decade that witnessed significant changes in the ocean transportation services market, 2018 was a more stable period for the industry. There have been no further consolidations among the top tier of ocean carriers. There does remain a surplus of ocean vessel capacity, and the marketplace is highly competitive, suggesting that cargo shippers will continue to benefit from lower freight rates offered by the ocean carriers. One area of uncertainty in the coming year is the International Maritime Organization mandate for vessels to either burn low sulfur fuel or to install exhaust stack scrubbers to remove the sulfur from the higher sulfur bunker fuels. The mandate begins in January 2020. Estimated implementation and then ongoing industry-wide compliance costs run as high as $15 billion per year. Now, normally ocean carriers will try to pass these added direct costs on to shippers. The Commission is monitoring this issue to ensure that carrier cost recovery efforts do not violate the Shipping Act and harm U.S. exporters and consumers. Commissioner Dye is leading an investigation to examine carrier and marine terminal practices in assessing detention and demurrage charges. These are fees that cargo shippers pay when a container sits at a terminal facility beyond allowed free time, or a container is not unloaded and returned to the ocean carrier within an agreed period. Commissioner Dye is in the final phase of this effort and will present her final report and recommendations to the Commission by September. Regarding our budget, the Commission is an agency with a specialized mission requiring a small but highly skilled workforce. We're requesting $28 million to support 128 full-time equivalent personnel in fiscal year 2020. Slightly more than $24 million of this request goes to salaries and office rent. All other expenses associated with operating the agency, such as information technology, consulting and outsourced services, travel and supplies, are funded from the remaining roughly $4 million. I am proud of the work that our dedicated FMC staff performs every day and the contribution our agency makes towards ensuring competition and integrity for America's ocean supply chain. We are grateful for the support of this committee and its members, and I look forward to working with each of you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the Federal Maritime Commission and its work. respectfully request the full written testimony be accepted to the record. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We'll now proceed to members' questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Admiral Schultz, you were good enough to spend some time with me in District 7 recently. We saw the incredible work we're doing in the Joint Interagency Task Force. We saw the work you do from the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos. We spent some time together on the U.S. Coast Guard cutters Isaac Mayo and Bear. You were good enough to dangle me out of the back of a C-144. And I remember a young man named Kyle Suga, who was our boatswain's mate, BM1, who piloted that OTH boat up into the back of the Isaac Mayo and notched it up there pretty good. Not a bad day's work for a young man carrying the Coast Guard Commandant and the chairman of his oversight committee. And I want to ask you, sir, because I know you're a straight shooter and you care about your coasties, since you and I met first at Michael Kozlowski's funeral in Mahopac, New York. The president's budget would take $1 billion out of your capital plan, out of your PC&I. I'm not going to ask you to get into the, to opine on that, except to tell us, sir, what would that mean if we took at face value the president's budget request of $1.2 billion? What would that mean for the United States Coast Guard? What would you do?
Well, Chairman, first, thank you for spending some time with the men and women of the Coast Guard, and obviously, I think that had an impact on your awareness of what our folks do to support the security of the nation. Your question specific on the capital budget, sir, I would tell you the 2020 budget submitted by the administration here, forwarded by the Coast Guard up to the department, does focus on our key acquisition priorities. First and foremost, the offshore patrol cutter I mentioned in my opening statement. That'll be about 70% of our offshore capability when we build out that fleet of 25 cutters. There's the second offshore patrol cutter production funding. There's long lead materials for the third and fourth cutter in that class. The Polar Security Cutter Program. There's bridging monies, about $35 million. The 2019 budget included a big lift of $675 million. If you look at about a 6 to 8 year trajectory on our capital budget as proposed versus enacted, we've been the benefactors of a lot of strong congressional support on Coast Guard acquisitions. But there's been a slight continuous uptick. 19 had that $675 million on top of that trajectory. 20 is an off year in terms of big funding for Polar Security as we get into 21, 22, 23. Our goal would be to build out 3 Polar Security cutters, the program of record, between now and 27, 28. So I think that some of that billion you talked to, sir, is accountable with the non-inclusion of $675 million for the Polar Security cutter in 2020. This is a bridging year. $35 million allows us to keep the program of record moving forward, program management. It's not a big amount of money, but I think, sir, we can stay on track with that.
And, excuse me, Master Chief, that young man, Kyle Suga, what he said to me on that boat that day was, what I like about the Coast Guard is, if you do your job, it takes care of its own. The Coast Guard takes care of its own, and the Coast Guard will have your back. What are your concerns about the retention and development of young men like that, your young coasties, when you look at this budget?
I'm glad you had a good experience with them. Our boat drivers are some of the best boat drivers in the world, and I'm thoroughly impressed with them every time I'm out with them as well. So, we're wringing every efficiency we can out of the training system. We could use assistance with operations and support funds. That's been fairly flat over the years, and as the new assets come online and they're a little more expensive to maintain, we're having to find those offsets from other places, and they're coming from some of the places that affect our quality of life. And I'd like to be able to offer them a little better conditions for their housing, a little better opportunities for training, and just basically take care of their families a little bit better through more opportunities for daycare affordability, things like that. Those are the things that take away from their focus while they're at sea. So I want them to take care of their families and take care of their things back home and make sure they have everything they need to be successful so they can focus on the mission.
Thanks, gentlemen. Admiral Busby, we have a terrible shortage of mariners in this country. What should we be doing to fix that?
Sir, the most direct way we can fix that shortage is by having more ships at sea for them to be employed. Quite simply, that's how we're going to grow our mariner pool. They have to have someplace to work. So we have to have a larger fleet, be it Jones Act fleet and internationally trading fleet, to have employment places for those mariners to practice their trade and to be promoted.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Admiral Schultz, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the budget request, and pretty bipartisan here, I guess. Some similar questions. When I look at the procurement construction improvement account, I noticed, I'm told that we're like 10 years behind on cutter acquisitions, 15 years behind in acquisition for new heavy icebreakers, nearly $2 billion behind on shoreside facilities construction, $1 billion behind in shoreside facility maintenance, no plan to replace our aging H65 helos, and a number of outdated freestanding databases, limited services. So I guess this is my first question. I haven't heard anybody mention about IT systems. You know, I guess replace the aging, freestanding, incompatible databases currently limit the Coast Guard's mission and their effectiveness. So, Admiral, you want to comment on this part of the budget, but then also comment on what your thoughts are about improving our IT capabilities?
Sure, Ranking Member Gibbs. Appreciate the question. We absolutely do have aging and arguably obsolete enterprise mission platform, what we call the system that all our applications ride on, and we're focused on that. What we have included in the 2020 budget is the first time it's a PC&I acquisition side, $14 million line item that starts to tackle that problem. You know, that is a big undertaking. We're watching what Department of Defense is doing as they talk about JEDI and a cloud-based application. We're actually going to the cloud this summer with some specific applications, the AUX data system that the auxiliaries, so we're informing our own knowledge. We've got we call our CG6, that's our technical folks, smart folks there. They're mapping a roadmap for us. This is a big functional, it's got to be a step function. I'm not sure when I took over last summer on 1 June, I anticipated this requiring my attention as soon as it did, but I think on my watch, we'll be laying the groundwork for a major recapitalization of our enterprise mission platform. And we're starting to do that in 2020 with this budget request, which is encouraging to me. What we've got to do is get our brain around exactly how you do that. We fielded about 1,100 what we call mobility devices, iPads, to the field, so we can have men and women actually, it brings some of the technology that's out there societally that these young, bright men and women want to have. They don't want to do their work, write down notes, go back and spend hours at the office when we should be able to upload that stuff in the field. So we're working this on an enterprise basis. We're working on a fielded mobility. It's created a sense of urgency to the folks that manage this to say, now that we put those iPads in people's hands, how are we going to give them the technology? Initially, it was a replacement for a bunch of books in a backpack. We're starting to see some solutions now in innovation that's sort of forced ourselves to be a little bit more forward-leaning. So I'm encouraged by that, sir.
I appreciate it. In prior years, the capital investment plan was required to submit with the President's annual budget request, and changing the law was required to submit the plan 60 days after the President's annual budget request. I was told that Friday, the committee still does not receive that capital investment plan. When would you expect to receive that 5-year plan, and will the Coast Guard efforts to modernize Coast Guard databases such as MISLI be tractable through future capital investment plans? Will these efforts be operating funds?
Congressman Gibbs, that capital 5-year investment plan for 2024 is in the pipeline clearing the administration. We also owe you the unfunded priority list, which is in the same clearing process. I don't ultimately own the final, when those are released, but my understanding is they're moving through the process. I hope they'd be imminent. We would welcome the opportunity to come back and brief yourself or the committee staff when available.
Thank you. Also, we got a new polar icebreaker, and when do you expect the first one to be commissioned in 2023?
Congressman, the way the recently awarded contract, the VT Halter, was rolled out, it's rolled out with a 2024 deliverable date, but there's incentives in there for early delivery, possibly, walking that back into fiscal 2023. But contractually, it's in 24 with the options of pulling that left here a little bit earlier into 23. So I'm optimistic. that we will meet the 2024, and we'll see where the next year and a half plus really completes the detailed design of this first polar security cutter. So we haven't built a ship like this in the nation here in, in many, many years. So I think we'll see where that goes, but 2024 is the no later than date, sir.
Is it correct to think that the majority of the time of the polar security cutter will be used in Antarctica to break out the research base down there, or we would see additional operating time available in the Arctic, as I know my predecessor, Don Young, would say Alaska?
Well, Ranking Member Gibbs, I would tell you this. My strategies that I've coined since day one in the watch has been a 6-3-1 strategy. 6 icebreakers, the minimum of 3 are heavy, what we designated now polar security cutters. The conversation, the 1 was 1 now. And 1 obviously now doesn't translate to the previous question, 2023, 2024. The first cutter will be almost a direct 1-for-1 for the Polar Star. That mission is an essential mission. I mentioned in my opening statement about a 105-day trek to sail out of its home port, get down there, break out into McMurdo. But there's probably 60, 85 days of shoulder dates availability that I think we would anticipate that first polar security spending some time in the Arctic. When you get into the second and third hulls, we're having a conversation about a lot more of a persistent presence in the Arctic. So we'd be represented in both high latitude areas, sir.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman, but just one quick statement. The Great Lakes also needs another icebreaker. My time's up.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I read a news article yesterday that Senator Rubio inserted a provision into the pending disaster assistance that would allow renegotiation or negotiation of the fixed price contract to the Eastern Shipbuilding Group. Their justification is their shoreside facilities were damaged. Of course, I'm pretty sure they had insurance. They say their labor costs are up. But I question whether or not this has something to do with their original bid, which some thought was low. I would like to know, as you move forward, if this is authorized, what are the factors that are involved in this? Because we don't want someone to bid low, get a contract, and then use a hurricane as an excuse to change a no-bid contract and then up the price to the Coast Guard. So I have concerns there, and I've got to say, I got concerns when a former commandant is in the news story saying now he's going to have authority to negotiate with the Coast Guard. That concerns me a little bit. So that's one point. I'm also concerned about the polar icebreaker contract. My understanding is there was a value to government that's rumored to be worth $120 million per ship. When I was at the White House a few weeks ago, the president was quite upset at the price tag per ship. And I guess I know that, I don't know if it's been protested or not, but I certainly would like to know what is the value per ship and what added up to what was the number? Was it really $120 million? And what's the value, since apparently other bids were considered qualified, but this was a greater value? So those are not really questions, those are requests that I'm making to you today. Master Chief, got 187 people on the bill to pay the Coast Guard when we shut down. I hope we won't shut down. I have put my 2 cents worth in on how we might not shut down the government. We shouldn't pass the DOD appropriations bill because they get paid until we have negotiated and passed Mick Mulvaney in the White House to not have a shutdown. And in that case, none of our service members will be paid, and then perhaps that will bring a quick halt to any stupid shutdown that radiates from downtown. And I appreciate your concerns, and I know it hurt morale a lot, and I really don't want people anticipating that this is going to happen again. Admiral Busby, I'd just like, again, in my conversations at the White House on infrastructure, the issue has come up of the Jones Act. And I'm told we really don't need the Jones Act, and particularly the president's chief economist says we should be competitive. And I asked him, well, so should we compete with the communist government of China selling things below cost? He didn't have much of an answer for that. I mean, do we get competition under the Jones Act? Is there, still somewhat of a robust shipbuilding industry in the United States of America?
Yes, sir, we do. There are a lot of Jones Act carriers, and there's pretty robust competition between them, so it's not a free-for-all by any means, and it is absolutely critical to our ship. We would not have a domestic shipbuilding industry save for government contracts if we didn't have the Jones Act.
And isn't, in fact, I think there's at least two fleets that supply Puerto Rico, and aren't they both undergoing major renovation of their fleets in order to better serve Puerto Rico?
Both Tote Maritime and Crowley Services have just inaugurated 2 new ships each, both LNG, are all LNG burning ships. They're the most modern ships out there right now that have been invested in that market.
Right. And if Puerto Rico was, the governors recently said, well, that they could do better if they just went into the international market. Do you think it's likely that little tiny Puerto Rico would be able to get daily or weekly service out of Jacksonville, Florida from the international shipping conglomerates?
I'm sure if there was a business case for some shipping company to do that, that they would do that. I think it would come down to finding, the economic conditions that would permit that. I don't know of those off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. I was remiss in not recognizing a former colleague of ours, the distinguished Dan Maffei from Central New York. Good to see you again. Nice to know there is a successful life after Congress. You give us all hope. Served his constituents in Central New York so well. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gosh, I don't know where to start. Admiral Busby, you said in your comments earlier, I think there's 50,000 vessels worldwide.
So 50,000 large ocean-going vessels.
Okay, and you said 180 of those fly the U.S. flag?
181, yes, sir.
Well, who's keeping score? 181, thank you. You said 80 of those are international?
81.
81, I can do this. Okay.
And 100 are large Jones Act ships.
Okay. And then you also mentioned having in the budget funding for a 3rd new training ship.
Sir.
Now, I'm from the Gulf Coast of Texas, and we happen to have a academy down there. I don't know if y'all are aware of that or not.
Fine academy, sir.
Yes, sir. We would argue the best academy of the 6, of course. Things are bigger and better in Texas. And so, we're working on a ship. You're aware of the ship that they have down there. Do you know how many cadets it houses, holds?
About 50 at a time for training, yes, sir.
Okay, about 50 at a time. And how does that compare with the other academies? Do you know?
Michigan Maritime has the same class of ship, so it's very similar.
Right.
New York and Massachusetts both have ships in the order of 600 cadets each.
Right.
Both Maine and California have ships that hold on the order of about 350.
Does Michigan get a lot of hurricanes?
None that I'm aware of.
None that you're aware of.
We get a lot of storms, but no hurricanes.
Well, Admiral Schultz knows. The great Coast Guard was down when Hurricane Harvey came through, and it was a big thing, and we really appreciated that. The Coast Guard was fab on helping with that, and we sure appreciate that. Of course, I'm pushing for another big ship. Of the 6 training academies, do you know the count of cadets in each academy offhand? This semester, for example?
Yeah, I know each, for instance, I think Texas graduates, they have 2 graduations a year. I think they graduate on the order of 150 or so per graduation.
How does that compare to the other 5 lesser academies?
I know Kings Point's going to graduate about 230 this year. Maine and New York just had their graduations recently on the order of around 200, 220, low 200s.
Okay. So we would agree that we really need funding for another ship. Would you agree with that, Admiral?
I would agree that all of the training ships are in need of replacement. Yes, sir.
Right. Well, we're hoping that we can get that in the budget. I have to hope and pray and believe that maybe the president's budget is an attempt to push way down low to see where we can come back up and we can get y'all funded. We want to be sure that we fund the Coast Guard. I'm on the bill. I think the chairman said 100, how many signatures? 180, 2 or 3 on the Pay Coasties bill. So we're glad to see that. A couple of questions for you. You mentioned Crowley Services and LNG in Puerto Rico under the Jones Act, for example. Now, for us, LNG is huge. We'd also like shipbuilding in our country to come up to that level. You did mention in your exchange with the chairman, I think, that you felt like there's a good shipbuilding industry, but I would argue that we want it even better, and we want to keep the Jones Act, and we want to make sure that we can train more mariners. I was looking over some of the notes here on training mariners. One of the things that you say you have a shortfall of mariners exist, and is that across all sectors of the industry?
It's primarily, the 1,800 number that I have used in the past, that's primarily unlimited tonnage, unlimited horsepower, ocean-going mariners.
I was curious, the Master Chief called them boat drivers. I thought maybe pilots or captains or whatever. But do the credentials of those qualified mariners match the needs of the surge sea lift vessels?
Yes, and those are the ones that I'm primarily interested in. While all mariners are important to me across the industry, the mariners that I'm going to need to flesh out the crews on the Ready Reserve Force ships are unlimited horsepower, limited tonnage mariners.
How can you do that? How can we do that?
Well, again, it kind of comes back to kind of the earlier question. We have to have enough of a peacetime steaming commercial merchant marine in order to have jobs for those people in order to progress. A lot of what we're seeing, we're graduating a lot of new midshipmen every year, a lot of new mates and engineers, but they're not staying all the way through because they don't have the opportunities for many of them to progress all the way to master or chief engineer.
I appreciate your focus, and I appreciate this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so looking forward to we getting that extra funding for our Galveston Academy, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate the gentleman. Appreciate my friend from Texas eliciting the fact that everything is bigger and better in Texas, except when compared to New York, apparently. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A whole lot of questions here. First of all, for all the members here, this is the Maritime Subcommittee. We've been trying for about 6 years to get a Congressional Gold Medal for the merchant mariners of World War II who had the highest death rate of any of the services. So I'd appreciate all the members signing on to that. We need a whole lot of names, so keep that in mind and we'll be around. Now, moving on. Admiral Schultz, what's the cost of the Polar Security Cutter?
The contract award here was for $749 million, coupled with some previous year's appropriations. There's about $300 million available. I anticipate that first ship is going to be, north of $900 million. We hope hulls 2 and 3 would probably come down below $700 million. It's a little premature, but those would be my rough order of magnitude numbers, sir.
So to meet your 633 cutter,
631 sort of lexicon, sir.
would be somewhere, what, $2 billion, $2.5 billion?
Congressman, the award is for, the initial ship and an option for 2 additional ships, a total of 3 hulls. The conversation, additional icebreakers was possibly, you're looking at maybe something less than a heavy breaker to fill the need. We may find, as we get into production, that we have, stable requirements, stable funding, predictable funding, that the differentiation between this heavy Polar Security Cutter and something that looks slightly different from a cost standpoint, we'd have to have those puts and takes. It's premature, but I think, sir, it's about $1.9 billion on the first 3, and then we'd inform the conversation on what we're talking about beyond hull 3.
There was a gee whiz moment for the U.S. Navy this last 18 months, and that is, oh my God, the Arctic is opening up. Yep, it is. So for a couple of $1 billion, we could have the heavy icebreakers. I draw this to the attention of the committee, particularly those that are on either the Appropriations or the Armed Services Committee, that this is absolutely critical, and that we simply ought to move forward and get those 3 underway now, not wait until current would be about 2030, current plan. Next, Mr. Admiral Busby, thank you for your leadership on the shipbuilding. I draw the attention of the committee to the comment of the previous Texan a moment ago. And by the way, the Academy in California, gentlemen and ladies, is the best. Now that we've settled that, yes, we do need ships, and Texas is a big exporter of natural gas. The Energizing the American Shipbuilding Act is about to be introduced. If it becomes law, we will build perhaps 50 ships, tankers, oil tankers, and LNG tankers over the next 15 years or so. Major opportunity to use a critical national security asset, natural gas and oil, and combine it with two other national security assets, the ability of our shipyards to produce large ocean-going commercial ships, and also the mariners that go with them. It's about to be introduced. On the Senate side, it'll be Senator Wicker. Draw the attention to the members of the committee to that opportunity to meet the needs. Admiral Busby, specifically to you, the question really goes to the Ready Reserve Fleet. You've been with several plans on what ships need to be built. You've mentioned refurbishing used ships and the like. Has that plan is it updated, is it available, and how does it fit in with the current budgets?
Thank you for the question, sir, in a very important area and one that I have a lot of focus on, as you can, and as we have discussed. Working very closely with the Navy, I actually had some discussions with Secretary Spencer last week about this. He is very, very focused on this. The Navy's three-pronged plan of service life extensions, purchasing with Congress's approval, used ships to bring in to be modified, and then new construction is still the plan, kind of record. We're working through what's the right business case, or what's the right ships to go after. The special mission ships of the Red Reserve Force are of particular interest because they're all steamships and they are all aging and they all have very special capabilities. So, we heard you. We are focusing very closely on those ships in particular.
Admiral, you produced a couple of placemats. If you could share those with the committee, I think it would be eye-opening for all of us. And if you could also provide a memo as to what the current plan is, it would be very helpful.
Sir.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Schultz, good to see you again. I've heard a lot from my constituents in the port of Green Bay. It's Titletown, USA, Green Bay, Wisconsin, in case anyone's paying attention. That there's an eminent need for a new Great Lakes heavy icebreaker. We currently have the Mackinac-class icebreaker. It's only half as wide as the vessels it escorts because it was intended to be working in tandem with a second icebreaker of its class, but the second icebreaker was never built. By itself, then, the lone Mackinac has to double back on the same path, which, of course, slows progress, slows commerce on the Great Lakes. It should be noted also that much of the iron ore shipped by the American steel industry travels on the Great Lakes. Obviously, we are in an interesting position right now due to our disagreements over steel tariffs that may be getting resolved, but that adds another complicating variable to it. So my question is, I understand that the Coast Guard contract that procured the current Mackinac was written to allow a second icebreaker to be procured, but it was never funded. Is that a correct understanding?
Congressman, I will take that for the record. I'm not sure I can tell you that definitively, but we can answer that very quickly and get back to you on that.
Okay, my other understanding is that the Coast Guard has begun a whole new analysis on the issue of a new Mackinac icebreaker. Do you have any insight into that, whether that's correct?
Yes, sir, Congressman. The Congress has supported us from 17, 18, 19, I think with $2, $3, and $5 million for a total of $10 million. Design and survey type funding. We are looking, kind of inventorying our current capabilities there. We have a report due back to the Congress, Great Lakes Icebreaking Acquisition Program report that was directed in the 2018 Coast Guard authorization. So we'll be delivering a plan to you on how we're looking at taking those design and survey funds and using them here. But some of it's inventorying what we have, looking at what it would take requirements-wise to build a ship at least as capable as the current Mackinac for potential service on the Great Lakes in the years of the future.
Is there an estimate of when the report will be completed and delivered?
Congressman, I think we're in final phases of that, but let me circle back with your staff and give you something.
And I understand that, anytime you write a report in DHS or DOD, you have to get, the interagency does its thing.
We are working on the report, and we owe you some clarity and transparency on what we have planned and done to date with those funds provided by the Congress.
I guess my concern would be related to the first question, that if we have already gone on record as saying that a new icebreaker is needed, that a second one was intended to be built, that if the new analysis is just a cause for delay, when we know what we need to do, that would concern me. So I just throw that out there.
Actually, if I could, just currently,
Please.
I mean, there's a lot of conversation about sufficiency of capability, capacity on the Great Lakes. We're focused on our current fleet. We're doing a 15-year service life extension of the 640-foot ice-breaking tugs on the Great Lakes. Yeah. That'll push them out into the 2030 timeframe. But, there is some urgency to look beyond that. Currently, we finished up the 6th hull last summer. The 7th and 8th hulls are under service life extension now. We'll tackle the 9th hull. There's 9 in Coast Guard writ large, 3 on the eastern seaboard, 6 on the lakes. And we think capacity-wise we're there today, but this conversation warrants some feedback from us on what the longer-term plan is to use.
And I just want to say your young men and women who are stationed up there in Sturgeon Bay are doing a phenomenal job and have really done a good job of integrating into the local community, and the local community has in turn embraced them. Indeed, during the government shutdown, I mean, the outcry I heard from non-uniform wearing local residents was very loud. And so I think that's a testament to the good work that they've done. You should be very proud. The other thing I just would ask on this issue of Great Lakes icebreaking, do we get any help from, for example, the Canadian Coast Guard? And if so, what does that look like?
Sure, we have an MOU with the Canadian Coast Guard. We have a terrific relationship. Our 9th District Commander aligns with the Canadian Coast Guard counterpart. I will be meeting with Commissioner Jeff Hutchinson up in Seattle here second week in June, and our collaboration with Canadians has never been at a stronger point. I think that is how we mitigate some of the challenges. There's extreme ice years, and then there's the typical ice years. I would tell you, capacity-wise, what we have done is we have brought a 140 ice-breaking tug in from the eastern seaboard to the Great Lakes during those, heavier ice years. As you see into the earlier parts of the year, that's going to be a heavy year. We bring an additional 140, and we rely on the Canadians. That MOU allows us to both look at what are we bringing in ship-wise. So collaboratively, we try to meet the needs of all the mariners on the Great Lakes who are working together.
Sure. With the 20 seconds I have left, did the Canadians actually assist with any port needs this past winter in the U.S. that you know of?
Sir, I don't have that definitive. I would answer probably so, but I can get back to you with a definitive answer.
And I'm all for cooperation with the Canadians, but I don't think we should outsource any of our icebreaking alliance to them. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question is for Admiral Busby. First, thank you for appearing before this panel, this subcommittee once again. Your important work to really promote our country's maritime industry. And I want to applaud MARAD's request for full funding of the Maritime Security Program. As you've already pointed out in your testimony, your support of the critical mission of a U.S. flagship, which I think is always at risk tremendously, and I think that your support is really very, very important. When you were here in March, I asked you about the Port Security Infrastructure Development Program at that time, which receives nearly $300 million in the most recent appropriations legislation. Ports and other stakeholders across the country are eagerly anticipating this program. This is a huge thing for the ports. According to the American Association of Port Authorities, their recent assessment, our ports have identified over $66 billion in needed infrastructure investment, and this federal funding is a step in the right direction. The question I have for you, Admiral, is can you tell me why the President's budget proposes to eliminate this program before we've even awarded the first grants?
Yes, sir, I'm happy to answer that. As you recall, the timing was a little bit off on the two budgets. When Congress put the money in for the port infrastructure development money in the 19 budget, our 20 budget had already left the hangar. It was already out and out. So we weren't really canceling it. It was not part of our budget initially.
Can you speak? Would you support it?
Well, I think port development is extremely important. We're looking forward to getting the notice of funding opportunity out here very shortly. It'll be within the coming months very soon. You know, we do have a lot of other port grant money that we do distribute, part of the build program.
Right. I believe there's an additional $100 million in additional funding
Right.
in that program, as you point out. But that doesn't make up for the $300 million that we're going to lose without the continuation of the Port Infrastructure Development Program.
As we're, again, the 20 budget is here. I mean, it was developed before the Congress funded put the money in the 19 budget, and we're just beginning the 21 budget right now. So we'll see where that goes. Obviously, the funding priorities will have to be.
Well, as I pointed out, that with the tremendous backlog and the tremendous importance of our ports and the $66 billion and having that $300 million in this year and the appropriations just being for the first time beginning to address some of those, even those grants are not all out yet. It's a big loss, and I just wanted to convey that to you. My last thing is not a question, but a statement to Admiral Schultz. I also represent the port area of Long Beach as part of the LA Long Beach complex, and we couldn't do it without the Coast Guard. And I am very, very proud of the work that we work with the Coast Guard in America's largest port complex, and vitally, vitally important, not just for the port, but for the national security of the entire West Coast, and I thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney and Ranking Member Gibbs, and thank you all in the panel for being here today. I'd first like to thank you, Admiral Schultz, for the important work and sacrifice the brave men and women of the Coast Guard make every single day. As you know, the Coast Guard has been invaluable to my district in southern West Virginia, performing the dangerous search and rescue missions and saving many lives. We all agree that it is important that the Coast Guard has the resources needed to continue to perform their duties while using our taxpayer money both efficiently and effectively. Admiral Schultz and Master Chief Vanderheyden, what major capital investments are needed most to maintain the Coast Guard's readiness? Is it the Coast Guard's airborne fleet ready to meet the search and rescue challenges facing the inland parts in our country?
Congresswoman, good to see you, ma'am. Thanks for those words of gratitude for your Coast Guard men and women in West Virginia. And Congressman Lowenthal, thank you as well for the work in the men and women in Los Angeles. Congresswoman, I would say, as I testified in my opening statement, our number one capital investment, acquisition priority is that offshore patrol cutter, because that will be the backbone of the fleet. We're continuing to build national security cutters. We're continuing to build fast response cutters. We've taken acceptance of 34 on a program of 58 on the latter, the fast response cutter. It's in terms of your question about airborne fleet and search and rescue work. We're flying what we call MH-65 Dolphin helicopters, an aerospace shell product. We got 98 of those. We will fly those, and we've already flown those further than others. We'll continue to fly those into probably 30,000 plus hours. We're in a similar situation with our MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, with their Jayhawks and the Coast Guard variant. We're going to fly those. We're watching closely what the Department of Defense is doing with future vertical lift. We have some service life extension programs in mind for our 60 helicopters. That is something that, because those dates seem to get pushed out, it has my attention, my vice commandant as an aviator. We're watching that closely. But we've got a plan here through this current decade. As we get into 2030, we're really going to be keenly focused on, just how far we can stretch those out. But right now, I'm comfortable where we're at, but we've got to start really putting together a long-term strategy on how we're going to do our air assets on the rotary side. Fixed wing, we're continuing to field, with the support of the Congress, C-130Js. We're upping the missionization of our C-27 medium-range long aircraft, and that's going to be a good airplane. We got a little bit of we got 14 of those transferred to us, but we're playing some catch-up on the sustainability, the missionization, but we're getting there. So I'm encouraged on where we are with our air fleet, but we got some challenges sort of a decade plus down the road, ma'am.
Good. Mr. Vanderheyden, do you have anything to add?
I would say that our aviation career fields are very popular. We have no problem finding people that want to fly in our Coast Guard aviation assets, and Our folks do a magnificent job keeping them, available and ready. We put more hours on them than any other branch of the service, and that is a testament to the quality of work that our folks do, especially down in Elizabeth City. So I thank you for your concern for our aviation readiness. We've been very fortunate. We put a lot of effort into our safety, and we've had very few aviation mishaps because our folks try really hard. Our air stations can use some help. Out in Hawaii, as we get the C-130J, they're a little longer. They don't fit in the hangar so well, so we could use some help there. But by and large, I very much appreciate the plan that the Commandant and our leadership team put together to transition our aircraft.
Another
Congressman,
quick question.
if I could,
Okay.
just one follow-on. One thing we are trying to do is that there are no more Dolphin helicopters, MH-65s, built in the world. So that fleet, is in a different situation. 60s, we have an ability called the Sundown Program. We get low-hour aircraft that the Navy put out in the desert, and for about $14 million, we can take that airframe at our Aviation Logistics Center in Elizabeth City and basically bring that into service for long service life ahead. So with some of the supplemental fundings and recent hurricane supplementals, we've actually bringing 3 on board. My intention would be wherever we have the chance to bring some of those former Sundowner hulls on board and offset some of our Dolphins with 60s, that's the bridging strategy. We're going to transition Borinquen in the near future from a 65 air station to a 60. So sorry for the recline, but that's an important point I left
You
out
just
there.
used up a lot of time. I also wanted to ask you about the major role that you all play in seizing the illegal and dangerous drugs flowing into our country. Has the Coast Guard seen an increase in the seizure of drugs other than cocaine and fentanyl?
Congresswoman, most of our efforts are in the transit zone, the area between the Indian Ridge where the drugs, cocaine is produced, and reaching the United States shore. So we predominantly are thwarting that cocaine threat. I think if you look across government writ large, I wear what they call the Interdiction Committee hat. Opioid use, methamphetamine use, those type of uses are all in the upswing. Where we focus our efforts is really on the cocaine threat, and last year was a slight downtick from the previous year. I think are explainable with some of our assets pulled off for hurricanes, but we're on trajectory this year for more than probably 450,000 pounds of uncut cocaine interdicted again, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Busby, at the March 6th subcommittee hearing, I asked you if for the small shipyard grant program, if the budget number would be higher than 0. And you emphasized that you had strong support for the program. I'm not suggesting that you said yes or no, but you did say you had strong support for the program. As it turns out, the budget proposal number is not higher than 0. It's 0. It's a $20 million cut from the enacted 2019, which I think Congress had to put in because the administration proposed eliminating it last year. I assume we will fix your problem for you again. And as well, the Senate committee passed a reauthorization of MERAD programs, including a $35 million authorization for small shipyards. So we're going one way and the administration's going the other way on small shipyards. Can you let me know what changed between the March 6th hearing and the release of the budget?
Congressman, what I can tell you that has not changed is the importance that we believe that program brings to the maritime industry. Again, this comes down to the realities of the budget we are given to work within to prioritize the absolute things that absolutely had to be budgeted for, and very regrettably, that was one that didn't make the cut. Does not by any way diminish how important we think it is and how much good it does to the industry.
Well, I anticipate that we will fix your problem. Admiral, at the March 6th subcommittee hearing, I requested details on Coast Guard's plans regarding oil spill prevention and response in the Pacific Northwest related to the Trans Mountain Pipeline Extension Project and have yet to receive specific information. Can you all get that to me for the record?
Absolutely, Congressman.
Thank you. We'll do a follow-up with you on that. Would you comment, though, on the flat funding for the Maritime Oil Spill Prevention Program for the 2020 budget and whether or not those resources are adequate and if that funding considers approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline Extension project.
Well, sir, regarding the Trans Mountain Pipeline, you know, we have a terrific relationship with the Canadians, Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada. We have a joint VTS up there where we track the traffic. I mean, currently we're looking at, potentially one of those transits a week under the current pace. This could go to one a day, as you know. Marine environmental response is a top priority for me. We work in a joint contingency model with the Canadians for oil spill response. I think at the end of the day, sir, with this bitumen, with the heavy crude, I think this is something the response operations that work there on the international seam are quite capable. So I think this is, obviously, we have to see where Canadian Coast Guard and the First Nations go with their deliberations, their decision-making. But we are postured to be responsive. I think the risk is manageable, and it is obviously high on my list of priorities to make sure that pristine region of the nation is not subject to some type of spill. It has my attention, sir.
Good, and certainly we can't control the Canadian government decision and how it plays out, but in the eventuality it does play out, we need to plan. So I hope we'll follow up with more detail with you. With regards to the backlog on shoreside infrastructure, we got the GAO study that shows about 45% of the Coast Guard shore infrastructure is beyond its service life. So we're working with you all, having discussions with you all about OPC, home porting in the Northwest as a possibility. If that were to occur, how does new shoreside infrastructure fit into the backlog that you have? How do you end up budgeting for new infrastructure versus what you have to fund now?
Congressman, I appreciate the question. What we do is we do, as you say, we have a high backlog. We have $1.7 billion of shore infrastructure that we're dragging along. We're not recapitalizing at a healthy pace on that like an organization do. You normally tackle 2.5% of that on an annual basis. We're in tens of percentages. That said, we're making a small dent in that. We've got some money through supplementals on hurricanes. To your question about new assets, we use what we call major acquisition shore infrastructure, MASI account. We anticipate those needs. Ideally, we ask for funds for that about 3 years ahead of the actual arrival of the new asset. So when the asset shows up, the pier, the shore ties, the infrastructure, landside buildings to support and enable the operations are all in place. Regarding OPCs, the 5th and 6th OPC are programmed to go to the Pacific Northwest. We've been looking at, a range of options: Everett, Astoria, Seattle. We had our folks up in Everett here recently that are on our Cutter Home Porting Working Group. The mayor of Everett was in here in April talking to Coast Guard folks. So I think in this calendar year, we will probably roll out a decision on where home porting will occur in the Pacific Northwest. It's a lot of factors: proximity to the area, the ability to support our people, existing infrastructure where we don't have to expend tax dollars. What are the upgrades to have sufficient infrastructure? But MASI, sir, is that major acquisition shore infrastructure. That's the approach we take about three plus years ahead of the actual arrival of the cutter to make sure when the ship arrives, it's able to do the mission and we can support our men and women that are assigned to that unit.
All right, thank you. I'm not going to ask a question, but I will follow up with you all about pilots and pilot shortages and how that all impacts you as well, because we're trying to coordinate with on the private sector side, making sure they're not poaching too much on the public sector side.
It's just, so
Thank
there's a
the gentleman.
Thank you.
We'll
Thanks.
get back
We'll
to you.
follow up. Thanks.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Semper Paratus. Good to see you. I'll be out on the IBIS next week, so I'm looking forward to that as well. I'll just give you everything that I have and let you, Admiral, Master Chief, just start going off on all this. I want to start with shoreside infrastructure as well. Undoubtedly, there's a lot of needs that need to be met out there. If you could triage a few of the most important, a no BS response to why these are the most important things that need to get done, that'd be important for us to hear. Moving a little bit over beyond that, into the 65s. How many of those 65s do we have available to replace? Can we meet that entire need with refurbishing those 60 airframes? And then what's the balance with doing that with looking at the future of rotary lift? Do you want to see all of those 65s replaced with refurbished 60s, or do you want to hold off on that a little bit, looking forward to what the future airframes might be out there in terms of rotary? I'd love to hear y'all speak a little bit on that. Thank you.
Let me grab that and let the Master Chief offer some color commentary. I would say first off on the infrastructure, sir, with the from the pull from the Congress, the unfunded priority list, which we were delinquent on, behind schedule on, but that will come to the Hill. That reflects much of our prioritized list of unfunded projects that are in that $1.7 billion. So that is the best vehicle. It allows us to sort of rack and stack and obviously what's attractive to members of the committee, other members of Congress have a chance to weigh in on that. So I think that's the best way forward there. In terms of 65s, there are 98. There are no more available in the world. So that will be, you know, we've been fortunate. We kept them in flight. We've got great mechanics that work on these. We've got a depot down at ALC, Aviation Logistics Center. But at some point, they become unsustainable. So where we can, we would like to replace them with service life extension, you know, that sundowner hulls, bring on new 60s. That's where we got to put a little bit of a more, you know, brushstroke details on a plan here moving forward, as future vertical lift just seems to, you know, continually increment to the right there a little bit. We've got to make sure we've got a bridging strategy. Is it sustainable within our existing fleet of 60s and increasing that number? Is there some type of interim period where we may have to contract some support? I think we got to take a little more holistic view than we have to date on that, sir. Master Chief?
Just to throw one more thing in the middle of that, can you talk a little bit about what is the risk? Is it responsible for risk to add another 10,000 hours or something to those those 65s? Is it responsible to the pilots to ask that of those airframes? If that's
Congressman, we will obviously, you know, the pilots, the safety of our men and women in the cockpit and the back side of that airplane is #1 priority. We will delve into that very thoughtfully. You know, that is a composite hull. It's not a aluminum type hull there, aviation aluminum type hull. So we've got to make sure we understand it. There's not a track record there. So we will proceed with the best industry advice, the best scientific advice, and make sure, you know, we're not taking any undue risk with the safety of our men and women in the Coast Guard. Master, you have anything to add?
Yeah, we have a lot of senior enlisted folks that are on those product lines that are rehabbing those, and they would let me know immediately if they thought there was an issue, there was a safety issue there. So I'm confident in them. Charleston, South Carolina is going to be a big hub for us. That's going to be it's a strategic location. We desperately need to rebuild some piers in Charleston, South Carolina. Station Tybee Island and Georgia's could use some help. Just being perfectly frank with you, and then Alaska is going to be a big challenge. Preparing those home ports in Alaska for the cutters that are going to be up there is a big deal. We want to be sure that Alaska is an attractive place to be stationed, and so we want to be. We have a lot of interests up there, so we want the quality of life for our folks in Alaska to be good, and so we need to build that out correctly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Schultz, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the, more broadly, the Coast Guard mission, and I know it's to ensure maritime security and stewardship. I often think about the Coast Guard, operating within the U.S. maritime time limits and boundaries, and I also think about the Coast Guard, for example, when I went to Guantanamo Bay, that you provide port security to the Navy and around the world. But I want to ask you about your operations in the South China Sea. In September of 2017, the Director for Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet raised concerns about the U.S. Coast Guard operating in the South China Sea. Later that same year, the Naval War College expressed concerns that the use of, that's people at the War College, not the War College as an institution, that the use of the Coast Guard forces in the region could increase the risk of war instead of easing tensions. Earlier this year, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter was deployed to the South China Sea to transit the Taiwan Strait and conduct operations with Philippine Coast Guard vessels. I mean, given the small size of your budget and the nature of your mission, can you sort of make the case of why that makes sense that the Coast Guard is operating in a way that looks more like a naval freedom of navigation mission?
Congressman, I appreciate the question, and I'll try to keep this short. I would tell you, the Coast Guard brings unique capabilities, unique authorities. We are in the Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, AOR today with the Coast Guard cutter Berthoff. We will replace her in the coming weeks with a second national security cutter. We'll cover about 10 months of the 2019 calendar year. That's at the request of the four-star Indo-Pacific commander. If you look at what's going on in that part of the world here, you look at how China is actioning, things there. They're using their Coast Guard. When you see a United States Coast Guard cutter with that orange and blue stripe, I think that represents, model maritime governance and behavior. I think we are the gold standard. If you look across the world, including the China Coast Guard, they replicate that hull design here, maybe different colors, but they use that Coast Guard symbol to brand their service. I think having the Coast Guard there is a different tool in the kit. We have done some Taiwan Strait transits alongside a Navy combatant. We are in the presence. I think the best application of the Coast Guard, obviously when I send a ship to the Indo-Pacific Commander, the 7th Fleet Commander, it's to do the business as they see most suitable in that region. I think for us, I think the Coast Guard offers an alternative, not just we're below that threshold of war here a bit. We're looking to get out to the Oceania region here in the coming weeks with Berthoff with the successor ship. We were in training with the Philippines at sea doing search and rescue exercise followed by port calls. We are offering an alternative to an increasingly aggressive China. China is using force with their Coast Guard, with their military militia against Vietnamese fishing and Filipino fishermen. So I think there's a different thinking here when you bring the Coast Guard in there. We are a locally based, nationally relevant, globally deployed Coast Guard.
Let me
There
ask
are
you this.
choices.
Can I just ask this question, though? I mean, I think of the Coast Guard, and you enforce the law of the United States, international law. I think about, for example, drug runners in the Caribbean, and, you're engaged there. I mean, but the notion that the Coast Guard is sort of enforcing the law against or balancing against another nation state's Coast Guard, and let's face it, their mission is different than yours, as you suggest. They're much more aggressive. They're patrolling alongside armed fishing boats. So, what's the nature of that engagement, and what are you anticipating, and what are your concerns in terms of that engagement with, for example, the Chinese Coast Guard?
So I'm going to pull it out of the South China Sea for a second. Say, if you think about your Coast Guard, we're the face of the United States government in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, the high latitudes. That is competitive space. China's been up there 5 of 6 or 6 or 7 of the last 8, 9 years, projecting their presence. So I talk about presence, equal influence in that region. On a day-to-day basis, sir, we're representing about 5 of the 6 geographic combatant areas. We just brought a ship back from African Maritime Law Enforcement Partnership, helping the Senegalese, Ghana, the Nigerians develop capability to protect, protein sources from the sea, as China and others are raking, through their waters and drawing more than 50% of their fish haul now off of Africa. In the CENTCOM area, I've got 350 coasties operating 6 patrol boats supporting the 5th Fleet Commander. So I think the misnomer is that the Coast Guard is a domestic, nearshore coastal organization. We're a global Coast Guard. I mentioned in my opening statement, though, I get funded about $340 million towards those defense operations, contributing about $1 billion. So I think those are choices. I obviously serve the Secretary of Homeland Security, and then I serve, force provision to the combatant commander, sir. So that's the challenge. Those are the enterprise choices about taking, an insatiable demand for Coast Guard and allocating finite capacity against all those demand signals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Asking unanimous consent to allow a gentleman from Louisiana to join the panel for the purposes of questioning the witnesses. Without objection, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much for your service. Admiral, the offshore patrol cutter, I've seen some news reports regarding the potential impact there. Can you tell us, is the builder of the OPC going to be on schedule, agreed to in the contract in terms of delivery of those vessels?
Congressman, thanks for the question. Chairman DeFazio made some points on that, but it wasn't in the form of a question. Sir, the offshore patrol cutter is our #1 priority. It has our top leadership level as interest as of that of the department. Eastern Shipbuilding Group owes us some deliverables here at the end of the month that are going to talk about the impacts. As you know, and we all know, Michael was a devastating storm to the region, recently recategorized as a Category 5 storm. So there is some impacts. What we're looking for is the specificity from Eastern Shipbuilding's feedback to us about how that will impact from their perspective, costs and contract schedules and things like that. When we get that at the end of, a week from Friday is the due date, the 31st, we will put our team of experts in-house and some contracted experts from the shipbuilding industry and do our analysis of that. And then based on that, we will see what the path forward looks like. This is a 25-ship procurement over the good part of 2 decades. Mother Nature here dealt a pretty tough hand to Eastern Shipbuilding Group. So we are informing, the way forward on that today.
Sure. Admiral, you know our strong interest in recapitalizing the Coast Guard. For many years, you all have been dealing with bubblegum and duct tape, holding assets together for way too long. And we have very strong concerns about the recapitalization and how it is actually synchronized, because you've got certain vessels that are coming in that play an important role in the overall role of the Coast Guard. And if you don't have certain assets to come in and fill some of the voids that are there, with some of the aged assets that we have, it potentially creates significant problems. Can you tell us if the vessels are going to be delivered according to the terms of the firm fixed price contract?
Congressman, the deliverable on the first ship was 2021, the Argus, which is going to LA, and that's what we're going to have to see. We're going to have to see what exactly, the puts and takes are as it impacts schedule, as it impacts cost in Eastern Shipbuilding Group. In terms of long ball, the 2020 budget has some money in there as we look at a service life extension for our 270-foot medium endurance cutters. Those started being produced around 84 timeframe. They're 33, 35 years old, some less than that. We have a fleet of 14 210-foot cutters built in the 60s, early 70s, and 13 270s built in the mid-80s into the early 90s. Those 210s at the end of the day are going to be, close to 60 years old. We're operating them today at 50, 51, 52 years old at 92% availability. So our engineers, our mission support folks are doing remarkable things. I'm confident we'll be able to bridge that gap. This service life extension for the 270s that we're just getting going with 20 money here seeding the way forward, we'll get there. It's not ideal to run 50, 60-year-old ships. Unfortunately, that's sort of the nature of where we are as a service, and we will continue to attenuate that. But I'm confident, sir. Obviously, we got to get all the analysis of the data from Eastern to figure out the path forward, sir. But if we can keep this program on track or close to on track, we will have capacity to continue to do the work of the Coast Guard. We're just going to have to keep some older ships going potentially a little bit longer. Arguably, we're a little behind where we are today, but I think this service life extension program is going to allow us to move forward here, sir.
Admiral, look, you are well aware that we have been huge advocates to get the Coast Guard recapitalized. You've been dealing with an aging fleet, vessels that have been used well beyond their intended service life. And it's very important to us that we keep these things on schedule, that we keep them on price, to make sure that the men and women in the Coast Guard have all the assets that they need to do their job in this incredibly expansive mission that y'all have been dealt over the last several years. I heard you loud and clear. May 31 is when you're going to have the information that you need, but you indicated y'all are going to be doing some internal processing on that. Can you tell me when you think you'll be able to come back to the committee and inform us whether or not, whether the firm price will be adhered to and whether the schedule will be adhered to?
Congressman, I would tell you it's probably a matter of weeks to process that, weeks, not months. And I would commit to you that we will do due diligence on that. Obviously, keeping this moving forward, we do not want to lose any days. This need to replace those cutters, as you intimated, is absolutely essential. That said, to go back to the drawing board here, where we're not to find a way forward successfully here with Eastern Shipbuilding Group, there's a time consideration there as well, sir. So we are committed at the highest levels, including the department, to make the right decisions on this procurement.
So Mr. Chairman, I'm hearing roughly mid-June for an update to the committee. Is that fair?
Sir, I would say before the end of June, and we can certainly try to move earlier in June, but I got to get a sense of just, did we get everything we need? We want to make informed decisions. Hopefully, the first tranche of homework, I'll call it for lack of better, from Eastern Shipbuilding answers the questions, but I suspect it's their first heavy lift with government contract. There may be some puts and takes there, sir, but we will do due dispatch to get that information to the committee as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Gentlemen, time's expired. We'll now proceed to the second round of questions. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. Gentlemen, I think what's clear in the first round of questioning is that this is a remarkably bipartisan consensus on this committee with respect to the priorities that we think are important and that are being underfunded in the president's budget request. So I don't want to put you all on the spot, but I think that the more you look at this budget request, I just like it pointed out for the record that when you look at the 11 statutory missions of the Coast Guard, when you look at what you guys are doing on border security, we talk a lot about that up here. When you look about what you're doing on drug interdiction, not just in the Caribbean, but in the Eastern Pacific, when we think about what the next generation of technology and improvements ought to be in that area, persistent overflight, use of drones. We look at your Dolphin fleet. We know you got to replace them. We know you got airframe problems. We know we're not where we should be on the polar security cutter program. We are way behind the Russians and the Chinese in our presence in the Arctic. We did a whole hearing on that the other day. We know what you can say and can't say about that, but we up here in a bipartisan way know that we haven't invested in that yet, and we are. If we were to follow the president's budget, we would continue the decade of neglect in the Arctic. We know we're not investing in our shoreside infrastructure. We see there's a $170 million cut in that. We know what it would mean to our personnel, where their costs of living are going up because they live in expensive seaside communities that have experienced all kinds of price inflation. We know what you make, and we know how hard it is to pay for your housing. We know what your retirement packages look like. The fact is that there's nothing about this budget that demonstrates a respect for the growing and critical nature of your missions. And that would be true if you weren't doing anything new. But the fact is that we have major emerging concerns about things like the export of LNG and the security of that, things about the Arctic and the great power competition there. These are new. We have an aging fleet of vessels and aircraft. We have all kinds of needs on shoreside. And so I just want you to know that we take that all seriously, and in a bipartisan way up here, I think you will see us do what ought to be done on this. I think it's disappointing that we can't get a document from the administration either that reflects the genuine needs that this industry and particularly the Coast Guard requires, but also that would at least let us know what the unmet needs are in a timely way for this hearing so that we could get that document, as the ranking member points out, in time to do us some good, because we're going to care about that, and we're actually going to keep faith with that. I'm glad we're moving the pay issue so that if we shut down the government again, we don't do to you again what we did to you last time. That was a disgrace, and most of the members up here agree on that on a bipartisan basis. We ought to stop treating you like an afterthought. And when we're paying the rest of our military, we sure as heck ought to pay the Coast Guard. So, and by the way, if we didn't pay members of Congress, we wouldn't shut down in the first place. So we ought to start by not paying the people up here, and we wouldn't put you in that place put in that position in the first place. So with all of that, I just wanted to unburden myself with some of that, but because this is a question and answer format, I am interested comment on in the Arctic. We did hear a lot of testimony on this recently, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk, particularly about following up on some of Mr. Brown's questions around the emerging, missions we're gonna ask of you in terms of what is happening in the Arctic, what we're seeing from the Chinese and others, and why that really puts a real urgency behind the Polish security cutter program. If you could, sir, what are you seeing in the Arctic?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for sort of your overview of the committee's bipartisan support here for the work of the Coast Guard and the maritime interests of the nation, sir. That is encouraging to know, and there's a lot in that statement. In the Arctic, sir, we are seeing different behaviors. China has a fleet of more than 4 dozen icebreakers. China is an Arctic nation with a broad Arctic coast. They're deriving, more than 20-25% of their GDP from activities in the Arctic. They're reestablishing bases.
Did you mean China, sir, or did you mean Russia?
I meant Russia first. Talking about the
yeah,
Russian
I thought so, because China's about 900 nautical miles from the
I'm
Arctic,
talking-
and yet they
just
call
talking-
themselves an Arctic nation, but
talking
I
about-
take your point. Go ahead,
Just
sir.
talking about the competing nature of the Arctic space. Arctic off of Russia, they're deriving LNG. They're partnering with the Chinese with a 30% stake in the Amal Energy project. They're looking to tax the Northern Sea Route. That will bring Russia back as a player in terms of deepening their pockets, despite sanctions. That's the Russian game. They're the meddlesome game. I think if you look at the Arctic off of Alaska, we've seen China up there. China is a non-Arctic state. They're a self-declared near-Arctic nation. They have now a second research vessel, the Shuilong 2. They launched last summer. It probably becomes operational maybe as soon as this year. They're talking about building a heavy breaker. So they are invested in continually projecting presence off the Alaska in the Arctic where we're concerned about it. The Arctic is a space with very limited communications capability or limited domain awareness. The polar security cutters are part of that conversation. In April, I rolled out a new Arctic strategic outlook that takes a 10-year look at the Arctic. We had just rolled one out in 2013, so a little bit early for a refresh, but things have changed. We talked about the Arctic as a peaceful, collaborative, environmental space when we rolled out our first strategy. Now we talk about it as an area of national security, and I say repeatedly, presence equals influence. Until that second, third Polish security cutter, we won't really have much of a game up there in terms of presence. But, China's paying attention to the sighting of F-35 fighters, fifth-generation fighters in Elmendorf. They're paying attention to the undersea cables that allow communications. From a national security standpoint, you hear General T.J. O'Shaughnessy at NORTHCOM talking about the pivotal importance of the access across the polar regions here to the nation, posing national security threats. So The Arctic is a competitive space. It is a national security conversation. And, you know, the Navy will continue to do ice edge and show up there on every other year basis. But we are the face of the government there. It's about projecting sovereignty, and we take that seriously, and we will continue to inform our understanding. We'll do Arctic Shield operations this summer again, some portion of a 3-4 month period to continue to define our learning there, continue to work with the indigenous populations, because as we increase our presence up there, we got to be sensitive to the, you know, to the stakeholders there across the full landscape.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you. Mr. Curry, I woke you up, I guess, because anyways, back in the last Congress, you testified for the subcommittee. He hasn't got a lot of questions. I'm trying to dealing with the consolidation operations among international container lines and the Federal Maritime Commission Authorization Act. We expanded your commission's authority to do things like prohibit the lines participating both vessel sharing and rate discussion agreements, prohibit joint contract negotiations between towing vessel operators and international carrier alliances, restrict joint contract operations between marine terminal operators and international carrier alliances, and so on. A couple questions there. Has the commission used these authorities, and also has the existence of these expanded authorities led to carriers to maybe change their behaviors without the commission taking action?
Yes, there has been some activity in that regard. For example, the Trans-Pacific Stabilization Agreement, which was the largest rate discussion agreement in our Pacific trades, in the face of the legislation, decided to just close operations. So that removed a large amount. This was the part of the Lobiano bill where you cannot be simultaneously in a rate discussion agreement and also in a vessel sharing agreement that might discuss capacity allocations. So they voluntarily left the rate discussion part of that. So, you know, that was I think a good result. The other part, I think, in terms of implementing the Lobiando Act, we have been going through, there's 438 different types of agreements that we have active at any, currently. So we've been very meticulously going through every single one of them. There are about 160 that have been preliminarily flagged as perhaps having some need for modification due to the Lobiando new requirements. We've been reaching out to each one of those and say, is there a need to come in? Let's amend that, those authorities to make sure everyone understands exactly what's going on. Yeah. So that's in process. Okay. There has been no new activity in requesting, joint purchasing authority. So I think the industry heard Congress loud and clear, and that's our... As
these, anything less competition or anything increased consolidation between the international carriers?
There has been, yes, as I said in my testimony, in the last year there has not been any new mergers, consolidations, either completed or announced.
Okay, I need to move on. I want to ask Admiral Schultz another question about the Great Lakes. Thank you, Mr. Curry. Appreciate that. Is it my understanding, am I correct, the Merrimack class and the Coast Guard wants to develop a whole new icebreaker class for the Great Lakes, or why don't we just, stick with what we got that works? And are we trying to, is the Coast Guard trying to move on to a different class of icebreaker for the Great Lakes?
Ranking Member Gibbs, I would tell you where we are today, sir, is we're focused on the current fleet of Great Lakes icebreakers. We have one Mackinac class, 240-foot, more capable buoy tendon icebreaking ship, tremendous ship. Congressman Gallagher asked about whether that contract was built in with provision for a second. I need to get back on that. I don't know the definitive answer there. We have the 6 140s of 9 140 fleet, Coast Guard at large, and we're doing a service life extension, push them out 15 additional years. So, 15 additional years puts us into the 2030, 2035 timeframe. So we need to be thinking about the future on Great Lakes. I would tell you today, sir, I believe we have sufficient capacity in our approach on the Great Lakes with the Mackinac, with the six breakers, and our partnership with the Canadians. There's obviously interest from the Congress here about looking at an additional large icebreaker capability on the Great Lakes, something Mackinac-like. So with the funding that was provided by the Congress over the 17, 18, and 19 appropriations, we're doing some analysis work on that that'll inform a way forward, sir.
Well, I guess I was wondering if the Mackinac class is, sufficient, do we need to develop a whole new class, or it would be cheap, obviously it'd be more cost efficient to use that if it's meeting the requirements.
So I think what might be the smart approach for us, as we had a conversation here with some of your colleagues about, a 631 strategy. Mr. Garamendi said, beyond these three Polish security heavies, talk about maybe what a medium breaker looks like. There might be some parallel construct between a medium breaker that could serve places in Greenland and other things to get after the high latitude work, and a breaker on the Great Lakes. There might be some commonalities here. So that's a conversation we would like to take. We just awarded this detailed design construction for Polish security cutter. There's been a lot of bandwidth as we're building NSCs, PSCs. Congress is interested in these waterways commerce cutters. I think that's sort of what's forward here. So I think this report that we owe you will start to share a little bit of what our thinking is moving forward, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask Admiral Busby a question, but I just do want to, without piling on too much, Admiral Schultz. I mean, look, you guys do a lot with a little. In the President's budget request for 20, your budget is 5% of the Navy's, right? 11.3 billion. The Navy's is 205.6. The Navy doesn't do a lot of what you all do. So I guess my point is, I don't want to see you doing a whole lot of what the Navy ought to be doing. The Arctic, different story. South China Sea, I've got concerns outside of providing maritime security or port security for our Navy, or perhaps training our allies' Coast Guards. I just have concerns with what might look like mission creep. But I do appreciate your response and that you are responding to what our nation asked the Coast Guard to do. So I want to thank you for that. Admiral Busby, based on data in the Military Sealift Command's 2018 in review, nearly a quarter of all petroleum products transported in the Sealift program were on foreign flag tankers. Additionally, it's my understanding that only 2 of the 60 ships in the Maritime Security Program are dedicated tankers. The rest are roll-on, roll-off ships, container ships, or multi-purpose cargo ships, which can occasionally be used, I think, for that tanker role, but only 2 dedicated for or exclusively tankers. It is concerning that the United States military is relying on foreign flag tankers to meet its military sea lift requirements. I guess my question for you is, how many additional tankers that are exclusively tankers do we need? And what I outlined, does that raise concerns to you, or maybe national security risks or an over-reliance on foreign tankers?
Thank you for the question, Congressman, and you've hit on a very important point. Of all of the programs that we have in place for national sea lift, we have the dry side pretty well covered, Maritime Security Program, visa program, other programs. What we don't have assured access to are tankers, and that is a concern. Yes, it is a concern. Especially if we got into a protracted sea lift in the Pacific, where we have to traverse great distances and be moving large volumes of petroleum. There are a total of 6 U.S. flag internationally trading tankers. 2 of them, as you point out, are under the Maritime Security Program. The others are, get chartered from time to time by Military Sealift Command. But the projections are that we would need upwards of 86 tankers to fulfill a continuous sea lift out to the Western Pacific.
Right. So I understand. We always need more than what we have, and what is probably within reach given the resources we dedicate to address the threats and the risks. But if we're at 2 to 6, as you described, I mean, is there a strategy to get to a larger number? And if so, what is the larger number and what's the time frame?
Well, there are a number of ways that we could get after that. Congressman Garamundi outlined one approach in his bit of legislation that he's proposing, along with Senator Wicker, a way to incentivize ships to come under the U.S. flag to be available to us in time of need. Again, it comes down to a business case, as pretty much all shipping really is, of the business case of operating your vessel. There are many, many U.S.-owned tankers in the world, but business case and cost of operating often keep them out from underneath the U.S. flag. So there are a number of ways that could be used to approach to bring them, incentivize them, and we're looking at several of those. A maritime security program-like approach could be applied to tankers, for instance.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves.
Thank you. I want to go through this very quickly because the chairman's made it clear to me that I don't have my full 5 minutes. Admiral, going back to the OPC, does the Coast Guard have the authority to modify the fixed price contract without additional legislation?
No, sir.
Would you, I mean, so it is feasible that if your evaluation determines that it's not in the interest of taxpayers, it's feasible that could actually be put back out on the street. Is that possible?
Congressman, I think, we awarded a firm fixed price contract. As I understand it, my understanding is to go back in and look at costs and schedule, things like that would require some type of a legislative authority to revisit that.
Are you requesting any type of additional authority?
We have responded to ask for Congress about some drafting assistance on legislation that gets into, an ability to open that up and possibly look at something like that. There's no numbers associated with that. We don't have any data to form numbers. So at the request of Congress, we provided some language.
But because you haven't done your assessment, it would be premature for the Coast Guard to request any type of additional authority. Is that safe to say?
Sir, I think we would say it's safe to say that we understand the impacts of a Cat 5 hurricane and the Eastern Shipping Group will have an impact on the OPC program. So recognizing a window of opportunity here with this disaster supplemental that is moving here, we have provided language recognizing this is in our interest moving forward to at least have that option on the table. The Congress will decide if that's something they want to look at, include or not. We have steered clear of, substantiating it. There's Eastern Shipbuilding Group advocacy on the Hill. We are detached from that. They are doing their thing.
Sure.
We are doing our thing. And right now, our thing with Eastern is you need to show us the impacts. We will do our assessment. If there's a mechanism to possibly revisit the contract, then we'll see where we're at the end of the day.
And so, Admiral, I want to flex the chairman's muscles here a little bit. Being the authorizing committee, it sounds like that's authorizing legislation. So certainly, if the Coast Guard is requesting authorizing legislation, I certainly would hope that the Coast Guard would come before the authorizing committee staff and members and have an opportunity to discuss with us if that's the case. Is that?
Sure, we will make sure our efforts are full transparency to the committee. If we haven't done that to date, we will circle back and do that.
Admiral, thank you very much, and I want to thank you all again for your service. Last comment, there were a number of news reports, and this isn't a question, just a comment, a number of news reports about Jones Act and potential discussion within the administration. I think it's really important for all of you, Admiral Busby, Commandant, all of you, to continue sharing within the administration thoughts on modifications to the Jones Act. I know that some of the different advocates for changes in the Jones Act are some of our allies, and those same allies are not putting up their appropriate NATO dues. They don't have an appropriate defense industrial base, and in many cases are having their ships built in countries that are not necessarily friendly to the United States. And I think that it's a really important discussion. I think that ensuring we continue to advocate for the Jones Act under these existing conditions is entirely consistent with this administration's policies on defense and ensuring we put America first. And I just wanted to flag that as I try and do each hearing when you're here. It is important to this country. I think it's important to our security. And again, I think it's consistent with other policies of this administration. So with that, I want to yield back 1 minute and 20 seconds to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman, I don't believe there are any other members' questions, but I do want to close the hearing by thanking you all once again for your service. I want you to know, Admiral Schultz, we appreciate the work your coasties do. We don't take it for granted. You make extraordinary and difficult things look routine. We know the sacrifices your coasties make. Master Chief, same comment to you. You know, as you know, a constituent from my district lost his life in the last year. It's a good reminder of the sacrifices our families make. We apologize for the additional burdens we put you through during the shutdown. We should never do that again. And you have our commitment that we are going to work in a bipartisan fashion to make sure we do not. Maritime Administration, Federal Maritime Commission, we appreciate the work you gentlemen do. Again, we're disappointed in some of the numbers the President's budget sent up here, but as you've heard on this panel, we understand the work you do. We understand its importance, Maritime Security Program, Jones Act, and I think you'll see that bipartisan support continue. With that, that concludes today's hearing. Thank you all very much. Hearing stands adjourned.